The courtroom was quiet, the kind of quiet that made your ears ring, the kind where even the smallest sound seemed amplified. It was a Tuesday morning, and the atmosphere was heavy with tension. At the front of the room, the judge sat behind his large desk, flipping through papers with a look of mild annoyance. The floor was polished to a shine, the wood of the benches smooth, the walls a dull beige. It all felt so official, so intimidating. It was the kind of place where decisions were made that could change lives, and in this case, it felt like the weight of everything was about to land on a young man's shoulders. At the defendant's table, a teenager sat alone. His name didn't matter much to the court. To them, he was just another kid who had made a mistake. His hands were folded tightly in front of him, and he stared down at the table, his fingers tapping nervously on the wood. His clothes, a simple hoodie and jeans, were neat but unremarkable. His face was hard to read. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't crying either. He was just there. He didn't make eye contact with anyone in the room, even when the bailiff called out his name. The prosecutor stood at the front, looking almost bored. He gave a brief introduction, laying out the accusations, that the teen had hacked into his school's computer system, altering grades and tampering with records. It was a serious crime no matter how you looked at it, and the prosecutor made it clear that this wasn't some petty mistake. The school had systems in place to prevent this sort of thing. They were secure, yet someone had breached it, someone had gotten in, and now the question was who and why. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, turning toward the judge, "this young man's actions show a clear disregard for the rules. He thought he could play with the system, change things to his advantage, and in the process he's endangered the integrity of the entire school." The teenager didn't respond. He simply sat there, hands still folded, staring at the table as if he could make it disappear if he concentrated hard enough. The judge didn't even glance his way as the prosecutor spoke, his focus more on the documents in front of him. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice sharp. "Let's get this over with," he said, his tone dismissive. "What are we dealing with here exactly? Another kid who thinks he's smarter than the system? Probably just trying to cover up his poor grades. This isn't the first time I've seen it." The teenager's face remained blank. The judge's words hung in the air as if to confirm the idea that every teen who ended up here was just another troublemaker. It was almost as though the judge didn't care to hear the full story, like the evidence already spoke for itself. The defense attorney, a middle-aged woman who had clearly seen her fair share of cases like this, stood up next. She was calm, professional. She glanced at the young man, then at the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to request that we take a closer look at the context here. This wasn't a crime committed out of malice or bad intentions. In fact, it might not even be a crime at all." The judge didn't respond immediately, raising an eyebrow. The prosecutor smirked, already thinking he had won this case. The defense attorney continued. "My client didn't hack into the system to change his grades. He was trying to fix a flaw that was affecting many students. The system was malfunctioning, and grades were being recorded incorrectly. In fact, many of his classmates were being unfairly penalized. He didn't tamper with the system for personal gain. He simply tried to correct a mistake." The judge leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He was skeptical, clearly not buying the story. "Oh, really?" he said. "So let me get this straight. This kid here broke into the school's computer system because he wanted to be a hero? Fix things? Sounds like a load of nonsense to me. We're not dealing with some kind of genius here. We're dealing with someone who thought they could play God with the system, and now is making excuses. Not the first time we've seen this, and it won't be the last." The teenager flinched at the words but didn't speak. His heart was racing now, his mind spinning. He could feel the weight of the judge's words pressing down on him, the doubt in the room thick like smoke. It didn't matter that he had tried to help. It didn't matter that he had never meant for things to go this far. All that mattered was the label being placed on him: troublemaker, hacker, criminal. But he wasn't that. He wasn't any of that. He just didn't know how to explain it to them, not in a way they would understand. The judge stared down at the teenager, then flicked his gaze back to the prosecutor. "Fine," he said. "Let's hear from the so-called expert. Bring in the school's IT staff. But I'm not holding my breath that this kid is anything other than a problem." The defense attorney nodded, clearly frustrated but composed. She motioned for the IT expert, a man named Mr. Benson, to take the stand. Mr. Benson was a middle-aged man with graying hair and glasses. He stood with a slight hunch in his back, like someone who spent too much time in front of a computer. As he spoke, his voice was steady, though he seemed unsure of how the court would take him seriously. "I reviewed the system logs," Mr. Benson explained, "and there's no doubt that someone accessed the school's grade records. But what's unusual is that the changes weren't malicious. There was no attempt to alter grades for personal benefit. In fact, the modifications were more like corrections than anything else. The system was malfunctioning, and the person who accessed it seemed to be trying to fix the glitch." The judge looked unimpressed. "That's what he says," the judge muttered, leaning forward on his elbows. "But anyone could say that. There's no way to know for sure what the intention was, is there?" The IT expert hesitated. "Well, no. But based on the changes made, the specific changes, it seems clear that the intent was not harmful. There's no indication that any student's grade was altered for any reason other than the system error." There was a long pause in the courtroom. The judge scratched his chin, staring at the documents in front of him. He didn't seem convinced, but he also didn't seem as sure of himself anymore. The quiet teen, the one he had dismissed so easily at first, had made things more complicated. The defense attorney stood up again. "Your Honor, all we're asking is that you consider the possibility that my client wasn't committing a crime. He was trying to help, and now he's being punished for it." The judge didn't immediately respond. The room was still. The teenager sat there, feeling the pressure building inside him, but he didn't say a word. He couldn't. He had already said everything he needed to. They didn't get it. They weren't listening. But maybe, just maybe, something in the judge's eyes had changed. The courtroom was still for a few moments, the air thick with silence. The teenager sat in his chair, his hands trembling slightly. He hadn't spoken much since the trial began. He wasn't used to this. This place, these people, the way they looked at him like he was some kind of criminal. It felt like the walls were closing in, the pressure of it all building, making it hard to breathe. His lawyer, a calm woman named Ms. Carter, stood by his side, her eyes fixed on the judge. She knew this wasn't going to be easy, but she also knew there was more to this than what met the eye. The judge had made his first judgment, but she could tell there was still a sliver of doubt in him. The IT expert had helped, but it wasn't enough to convince the judge completely. There was still that lingering skepticism, the belief that the teenager sitting before them was just another troublemaker. But Ms. Carter was determined to change that. She turned to the judge and spoke carefully, her voice steady but urgent. "Your Honor, I ask that you consider what we've presented here. My client didn't hack the system to benefit himself. He didn't do it to hurt anyone. He did it because he saw a problem and he wanted to fix it. He wasn't breaking the law for fun. He wasn't trying to cause chaos." The judge looked at her, then at the teenager. "I get what you're saying, but this isn't a simple mistake, is it? We're talking about breaking into a computer system. That's serious. No one just fixes things like that." Ms. Carter sighed, her patience starting to wear thin. "Of course, Your Honor. But think about it. The glitch was affecting students. Their grades were wrong. They were being punished for something that wasn't their fault. The only person who noticed the problem and tried to fix it was the teenager sitting right there." She pointed to the teenager, who still hadn't looked up. The judge paused, considering her words. The teenager could feel the weight of his gaze on him, but he didn't want to meet it. He didn't want to feel like the focus of the room, the object of everyone's judgment. He just wanted it to be over. The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. "I hear what you're saying, Ms. Carter, but it's still a crime. He accessed the system without permission. That's breaking the law no matter how you look at it." Ms. Carter nodded, understanding his point. "But what if the law isn't always the right answer in cases like this? What if sometimes it's more about intent? What if this was more about trying to help than harm?" The judge's face softened for a moment, just a fraction, but it was enough. He wasn't ready to let go of his initial judgment, but something in his demeanor told the teenager that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to listen. Before the judge could respond, the prosecutor stepped forward again, eager to steer the conversation back to where he wanted it. "Your Honor, let's not forget what we're dealing with here. A student broke into a school's secure system. It doesn't matter if he thought he was helping. The fact is, he committed a crime. And now we're sitting here discussing whether or not he should be punished for it?" The prosecutor's words stung, but the teenager didn't react. He knew what the prosecutor was trying to do. Make him feel small, make him feel guilty, like he didn't deserve to be there. But he wasn't guilty. He had done the right thing. The problem was, no one seemed to see that. Ms. Carter, though, wasn't backing down. "Your Honor," she said firmly, "I understand the seriousness of the situation, but we're also talking about a young man who acted out of a sense of responsibility, not selfishness. He could have ignored the issue, but he chose to act. Isn't that what we should be encouraging in young people? Taking responsibility, solving problems, doing the right thing even when it's hard?" The judge didn't answer right away. His eyes shifted back to the teenager, who still hadn't looked up. It was clear that the boy was trying to stay out of the spotlight, to keep his thoughts to himself. But there was a growing sense of frustration inside him. Why couldn't anyone see that he wasn't a criminal? Why did they insist on treating him like one? After a long pause, the judge stood, his chair creaking beneath him. He adjusted his glasses, then turned to the teenager. "All right," he said, his voice softer now. "Let's hear from you." The teenager froze. His heart pounded in his chest. This was it. This was the moment. The judge was giving him a chance to speak. But what could he say? What could he possibly say that would make them understand? He took a deep breath and stood up slowly, his legs shaky. He didn't know where to begin. All the words in his head were jumbled, mixed up with the noise of the courtroom, the weight of the judge's stare, the murmurs of the spectators in the back. But he couldn't just sit there and say nothing. He had to try. For himself, for his future. He opened his mouth and the words came out in a quiet rush. "I didn't mean to do anything wrong. I wasn't trying to break the law. I saw something that wasn't right. I saw students, my friends, getting grades that weren't theirs. They were getting punished for something they didn't do. I didn't want them to suffer because of a system glitch, so I tried to fix it. I didn't know it would get this far. I didn't know what would happen." The room was silent. Even the prosecutor seemed taken aback by the teenager's words. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't trying to get myself ahead," the teenager continued, his voice a little stronger now. "I didn't change my grades. I didn't touch anything that belonged to me. I just fixed what was wrong. That's all. I didn't think I was doing anything bad. I just thought I was helping." There was a long pause, and for a brief moment, the teenager wondered if the judge would dismiss him again, if the judge would tell him that he was still guilty, no matter his intentions. But instead, the judge stayed silent, looking at him with a mix of confusion and curiosity. For the first time since the trial began, the teenager felt like he wasn't being judged for his actions, but listened to for the first time. Ms. Carter gave the teenager a small, encouraging nod from her place beside him, but she said nothing. It was up to him now. The judge's silence was a sign. The teenager knew that deep down the judge wasn't entirely convinced by the prosecutor's argument. He wasn't sure how this would end, but something had shifted. Maybe there was a chance. Maybe things could turn out differently. The judge looked down at the papers on his desk, adjusting his glasses again. It was as though he was weighing the teenager's words, letting them settle in his mind. Finally, he spoke, though his voice was much quieter than before. "I'll consider what you've said," the judge said. "But you have to understand, breaking the law is still breaking the law, no matter how good your intentions were. It's not just about fixing a glitch. It's about trust. The trust that the system is secure. The trust that students and faculty can rely on the rules in place." The teenager nodded, feeling a small weight lift off his shoulders. At least the judge was listening. At least he was seeing more than just a crime. The room was still as the judge spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "But I'm not ready to make a decision yet. We need to look at everything. I'll take some time to review the evidence. In the meantime, I want to hear from more experts, and I want to know more about this system glitch you've mentioned. This isn't over yet." The teenager's heart sank a little, but at least it wasn't a dismissal. At least there was still a chance. The court adjourned for the day, and as the teenager stood up, he felt a small flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had when he first walked in. Maybe, just maybe, the truth was starting to find its way through the noise. The next day, the courtroom buzzed with an air of anticipation. The teenager had spent the night feeling the weight of everything pressing on him. After speaking in front of everyone, after hearing the judge's tentative response, it was hard to shake the feeling that he was still walking on the edge of something. Was the judge truly considering his words, or was he just going through the motions? When the teenager entered the courtroom, he couldn't help but notice the change in the atmosphere. Yesterday had been tense, like everyone was just waiting for something to go wrong. Today, however, the crowd seemed quieter, more focused. There was no chatter in the corners, no side conversations. Everyone was waiting to hear the next move in the case. The teenager sat down at the defendant's table, his lawyer beside him. His heart was pounding, but he tried to stay calm. He didn't want to think about the outcome right now. He couldn't. It was enough to just be here and know that he hadn't been thrown out yet, that his words had made some kind of impact. But how much? That was the question hanging in the air. The judge entered the room and the tension seemed to escalate again. As the gavel hit the surface, it echoed like a loud crack, signaling the start of the session. The judge, looking as serious as ever, addressed the room with a quick glance. "Let's get to it," the judge said, his tone flat but not as harsh as it had been the day before. He looked down at the papers in front of him, scanning over the notes. The teenager's lawyer stood up first, ready to move things along. "Your Honor," Ms. Carter began, "as we discussed yesterday, I would like to request that we focus on the intent of the actions taken by my client. We've provided evidence of the system glitch, and we've heard from the IT expert that the changes made were consistent with attempts to repair the issue, not cause harm." The judge nodded slowly, not responding right away. He was still going over the details in his head. The teenager tried to read his face, but it was hard to tell where his thoughts were. The judge had made it clear he wasn't an easy person to convince, but the fact that they were still talking about the case was a small victory. After a moment of silence, the judge finally looked up. "The thing is," he said, his voice quieter than before, "no one should be accessing systems they aren't authorized to. No one should be tampering with data no matter the reason. It's a matter of security." The teenager winced at the words even though he knew the judge had a point. He understood that it wasn't just about what he intended. It was about the fact that he had broken a rule, one that everyone had to follow. "I get that, Your Honor," Ms. Carter responded, her tone respectful. "But sometimes the system fails. Sometimes good people see a problem and try to fix it. My client didn't break the rules for personal gain, nor did he do so with any malicious intent. He simply did what he thought was right." The judge raised an eyebrow, still skeptical. "And that's the issue, isn't it? Good intentions don't always make things right. If we let people fix problems they see on their own, without following the proper procedures, we open the door for more chaos. There has to be a limit to what we allow." There was a brief pause. The teenager felt the weight of those words. He had never wanted chaos. He had never wanted to break anything. He had just seen something wrong, something that needed fixing. And instead of walking away, instead of letting it happen, he had acted. But how could he explain that to a judge who had so much more experience than him? How could he make him understand that he wasn't trying to cause trouble, that he was trying to make things better? The judge sighed, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "I know you think what you did was helpful, and I'm not blind to the fact that your actions, while unauthorized, weren't meant to cause harm. But the problem is, the law doesn't look at things the way you or I might. The law has to look at the facts. Someone accessed a secure system without permission, and there's no telling what could have happened if the changes had been made by someone with bad intentions." The teenager's heart dropped. It was as if everything he had said, everything he had tried to explain, was being brushed aside. The words were out there, but they didn't seem to matter. It was just about the rules, about what had been done, not why it was done. But then, just as the teenager was about to give up hope, the judge's voice broke through again, a little softer this time. "However," the judge continued, "there is something to be said for the fact that no one was hurt. No grades were altered for personal gain. No one's future was jeopardized by the changes you made, and from what I'm hearing, you were simply trying to help." The teenager felt a spark of hope in his chest, but he didn't let it show. He had to stay calm, stay focused. The judge wasn't done yet. The courtroom was quiet as the judge continued. "I'm going to take this case seriously. We'll need more testimony, more expert opinions on the system and what happened. But I can't ignore the fact that your actions were, at least in some way, an attempt to correct an injustice. That's something." The teenager didn't know how to react. Part of him wanted to jump up and shout, to feel like all his efforts had finally been recognized. But another part of him was still unsure. The judge wasn't letting him off the hook just yet. There was still more to come. The judge leaned forward slightly, his hands pressed together in front of him. "But," he added slowly, "this doesn't mean you're off the hook. There's still the issue of breaking into a secure system. That's not something we can just ignore. Ms. Carter nodded, acknowledging the judge's point. She knew this wasn't going to be a simple fix, but she also knew they had made progress. They had shifted the conversation. They had made the judge stop and think about the bigger picture. It was a small victory in a long battle, but it was progress nonetheless. I understand, Your Honor, Ms. Carter said calmly, and we're not asking for you to ignore the law. We're asking for you to look at the intent behind the actions. We're asking for you to consider the fact that in this case the teenager was trying to help, not harm. The judge looked at the teenager again, his gaze lingering. The teenager felt the weight of that gaze once more. It wasn't harsh this time, but it wasn't entirely soft either. The judge seemed to be weighing everything carefully, considering all the angles. Finally, the judge spoke again. All right, I'm going to take a closer look at everything, and I'll make my final decision in the coming days. But I want to make one thing clear. This isn't just about what happened in this courtroom. It's about how we move forward. We need to make sure that in the future, no one else tries to fix problems in the way you did. That's not how things work. But I'll take what I've heard into consideration. As the session came to a close, the teenager felt a mixture of relief and nervousness. The judge hadn't made a decision yet, but he hadn't ruled against him either. For the first time in days, he felt like there was a chance. A real chance in that things could turn out all right. The days after the last court session were filled with uncertainty. The teenager couldn't stop thinking about everything that had been said. The judge had seemed like he was considering things, but what did that mean? He hadn't made a decision yet, and the waiting was unbearable. He spent his evenings in the quiet of his room, staring at his homework, but his mind kept drifting back to the courtroom. His lawyer, Ms. Carter, had said they'd done everything they could. She'd reassured him that they'd presented a solid case, that they'd done their best to show the judge his intent. But the uncertainty lingered. The law was clear about the crime, unauthorized access to a computer system, and no matter how much he had tried to explain that he wasn't a criminal, he was still technically guilty. Each morning, the teenager checked his phone anxiously, hoping for an update, for any sign that the judge had made a decision. But there was nothing. It was as if the world had paused, leaving him in limbo. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for, but part of him just wanted the whole thing to be over. He was tired of living with the constant pressure of it hanging over him. And then, on the fourth day after the trial, his phone rang. It was Ms. Carter. Hello, he answered, his voice tight with nerves. Good morning. I have an update for you, she said. Her voice was calm, but there was something in it that caught his attention. He couldn't tell if it was good or bad, but she was speaking with purpose, as if she had something important to share. The teenager sat up straighter in his chair, his heart racing. What's the update? The judge has made his decision, she said. We're meeting in court this afternoon for the final ruling. He swallowed hard. His throat felt dry, and he couldn't quite wrap his mind around what that meant. The judge had made his decision. He had no idea what it would be, but he couldn't stop the mix of hope and anxiety that flooded him. Okay, he said, trying to sound calm. I'll be there. Ms. Carter gave him a reassuring word before hanging up, but all he could do now was prepare himself for whatever was coming. He knew he had no control over the outcome. He could only wait and hope that the judge had seen things the way he had intended them to be seen. The time seemed to drag on as he walked to the courthouse. Every step felt heavier than the last. He had been here before, but today felt different. The room he had sat in for the past few days now seemed like an arena, a place where everything would be decided, where he would be judged for everything that had happened. When he arrived, he found his lawyer waiting for him outside the courtroom. She smiled faintly when she saw him, but didn't say much. It was clear she was just as tense as he was. The teenager took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. Do you think it'll be okay? Ms. Carter hesitated for a moment before answering. I don't know. The judge has had time to think things through. It could go either way, but you've done everything you could. That's all you can control. He nodded, though it didn't help ease the weight on his chest. Ms. Carter led him into the courtroom, where they both took their seats. The room was still, the silence only broken by the sound of footsteps and the rustle of papers. When the judge walked in, everyone stood in respect. The teenager's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the judge take his seat. He had been prepared for a long wait, but now everything felt like it was happening all at once. The judge looked down at the papers in front of him. The teenager tried to read his face, but it was unreadable. The judge was still, his expression focused as he read through the documents. Time seemed to stretch out in the room, every second feeling like an eternity. Finally, the judge cleared his throat and looked up. "I've spent several days reviewing this case carefully," he began. His voice was steady, but there was a weight behind his words. "I've listened to the testimony, I've considered the evidence, and I've reflected on the arguments made by both sides." The teenager held his breath, not sure if he was ready for what was coming next. His hands were clammy, his heart racing. The judge continued. "At first, I was concerned about the fact that the defendant accessed a secure system without authorization. This is a serious violation of the law, and it cannot be taken lightly." The teenager's stomach twisted. It felt like his worst fear was coming true. The judge was about to make his decision based solely on the rules, without considering anything else, but, the judge said, pausing as he glanced down at the papers once more, "There's more to this than just breaking the law." He looked up again, meeting the teenager's gaze. After hearing from the defense, considering the context of the actions, and recognizing that no harm was done, "I've come to a conclusion that I hope will serve as both a lesson and an opportunity." The teenager exhaled. His breath caught in his chest. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. The judge continued. "I acknowledge that the defendant acted with good intentions. He saw a problem, and instead of ignoring it, he tried to fix it. That is something that should be recognized. However, I also understand the importance of following the law and ensuring that actions like these do not set dangerous precedents." The teenager leaned forward slightly, hanging on to every word. "I've decided," the judge said, "that the defendant will not face jail time. Instead, he will be required to participate in a community service program that focuses on cybersecurity and technology education for young people. Additionally, I will be recommending that the defendant attend counseling to help him understand the full scope of his actions and their potential consequences." The teenager's mind spun. He wasn't going to jail. He wasn't going to be branded a criminal forever. But community service? Counseling? Was that really what he deserved? The judge's voice softened slightly. "This decision is not a free pass. It's an opportunity for the defendant to give back to the community, to use his talents in a positive way, and to learn from this experience. If he follows through with the program and shows true growth, I will consider reducing any further consequences." The teenager sat back in his chair, feeling like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. It wasn't a perfect outcome, but it was better than what he had imagined. He wasn't being punished forever. He had a chance to make things right. Ms. Carter gave him a small, approving smile. The teenager felt a surge of relief wash over him. The judge hadn't just given him a second chance. He had given him a way to move forward, a chance to turn this mistake into something better. As the judge concluded, the teenager stood up with Ms. Carter, his heart still racing but his head clearer than it had been in days. He had learned something important during this trial, not just about the law, but about himself. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about understanding the consequences of your actions and doing what you could to make things right. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the teenager stayed behind for a few moments. He looked around, taking in the space one last time. This place had felt so hostile before, so foreign. But now it seemed more like a chapter in his life, one that he was ready to close, and one that had taught him a valuable lesson. The weeks that followed the judge's decision felt like a turning point. The teenager had entered a world that was much bigger than himself, a world of responsibility, learning, and understanding the consequences of his actions. It wasn't easy, but he knew that he had to make the most of it. He had been given a second chance, and he didn't want to waste it. Community service was never something he had imagined himself doing. But as he sat in the small room filled with other young people who had made mistakes, he realized that this was a place where people could change. There were no judgments here, just a chance to learn and grow. He wasn't the only one who had made a poor decision, and that made him feel less alone. Everyone in that room had their own story, their own reason for being there. The first few sessions were difficult. He wasn't used to sitting down and talking about his actions in such a direct way. But the facilitators of the program were understanding. They didn't lecture him. They didn't treat him like he was just another person who had messed up. They treated him like someone who could do better, someone who could learn from his mistakes and find a way to use his talents for good. One of the main things he learned in the program was how vulnerable systems could be. In the beginning, he had only seen what he had done as a simple fix, something that could help. He hadn't realized the deeper consequences, the bigger picture of what could have happened if he had been dealing with something more malicious, or if someone else had taken the same steps he had without knowing the risks. One session in particular stood out. They brought in a guest speaker, an expert in cybersecurity who had worked with various companies to help them protect their data. The speaker explained how a single mistake could cause a company millions of dollars in losses. He talked about how some hackers didn't just break into systems to steal information, but to destroy it. They would change or delete things, causing confusion and chaos. The teenager had never really thought about it that way. Before, he had only been focused on his desire to fix the problem. But now he understood that even the smallest action, without thinking it through, could lead to serious consequences. It was a sobering thought. He had always been someone who wanted to help, but now he saw how important it was to know what you were doing before you took action. The class wasn't all heavy stuff. There were moments of laughter, too. There were other teens in the program who had done things they regretted, but they were all trying to make things right. Some of them had gotten in trouble for things like hacking video games, others for posting inappropriate content online, but all of them were learning the same lessons. One day, the teenager found himself talking to a guy in the program who had gotten into trouble for messing around with his school's network. The guy was a tech whiz just like him, but he had gotten too curious about how the system worked and ended up breaking some rules in the process. They talked for a long time about how important it was to learn the right way to use their skills, how much better it would feel to use their knowledge for positive things rather than risk getting caught up in something bad. "That's the thing," the other guy said. "We have all this knowledge. We're not stupid. But if we don't know how to use it in the right way, we're just causing problems." The teenager nodded. It was exactly what he had been feeling. He had never set out to hurt anyone or make things worse, but he had learned that sometimes the right choice wasn't always clear. And sometimes doing what you think is right in the moment can lead to more harm than good. By the time the community service program was over, the teenager had gained a new perspective on his skills and the responsibility that came with them. He knew now that he had to be careful with how he used his knowledge. He wasn't just some kid who could solve problems without thinking things through. He was someone who could make a real difference, but only if he approached everything with caution and care. As he completed the program, he felt a sense of accomplishment. Not just because he had fulfilled his community service hours, but because he had grown. He had learned how to use his talent for good, how to channel his curiosity into something constructive, and how to understand the impact of his actions on a larger scale. The next step in his journey was counseling. It wasn't something he was thrilled about at first, but over time, he began to understand why it was part of the judge's decision. The sessions helped him reflect on why he had acted the way he did. It wasn't just about fixing the system he saw as broken. It was about deeper things. His desire to prove himself, his need to fix things because he didn't always feel like he was in control of other parts of his life. Counseling wasn't easy. Talking about his feelings, his motivations, and the mistakes he had made was uncomfortable. But with each session, he began to understand more about himself. He started to see patterns in his behavior, ways that his actions were often driven by a desire for validation, or the need to feel like he was doing something important. He realized that while he had good intentions, he hadn't always thought about the bigger picture. He had acted impulsively, without considering the consequences of his actions or how they might affect other people. The counselor helped him see that it was okay to make mistakes. What mattered was how you learned from them and how you moved forward. The teenager began to understand that he didn't have to prove anything to anyone by fixing problems without thinking it through. It was okay to ask for help, to take a step back and to think before acting. Months passed and the teenager's life slowly began to get back to normal. The case was behind him, and he had fulfilled all the requirements the judge had set for him. But it wasn't just about finishing the community service and counseling. It was about the lessons he had learned along the way. He felt more confident in his ability to make thoughtful decisions. He knew that if he continued to use his skills for good, he could make a real difference in the world, one that didn't come at the expense of others. Looking back, he was grateful for the chance to turn things around. He had learned valuable lessons that would stay with him for the rest of his life, and though he would never forget the fear and uncertainty of that time, he now knew that mistakes didn't define him. What mattered was what he did after the mistake, how he grew, and how he used his abilities for something meaningful. In the end, he had found his way, not by fighting against the rules but by learning to work within them, and that was something he could be proud of.